Yeah, thank you very much for joining Energy Live News, especially at such a difficult time for Ukraine. We would like to start this interview with the situation right now in Ukraine. How's the things there?
I mean, where to start? So I guess on a personal note, I can say that as I am in Ukraine currently, but not in my hometown, Kyiv, I had to flee it on 24th of February when the war started. So I'm in the Western Ukraine, and as I said, depends on the geography. The situation might be a bit different. Very different, actually, because there are cities in the western part of Ukraine which have not been bombarded, for example, and just experience the air alarms. And this is exactly the situation in which I'm living right now. We have, I don't know, like up to 8 air alarms a day, usually about 5, and it means that we need to take shelter, and then there is a risk for attack. But there are cities which are actually being attacked every day and on a different scale of severity. You probably have learned the name of the city Mariupol, which has basically became, I don't know, like an example of the horrors of the war. What it brings when it comes to your land. And there are different information coming from the city because, coming from the officials, because there's almost none of the information that coming from the city because the city is closed and it is being attacked constantly. There's like 90% of the buildings are damaged or destroyed completely. And this is the city where 500,000 people lived, so 500,000 population. Just for comparison, the city where I am is like 150, maximum 200,000 people living here. But in Kyiv, it's like millions. So of course, the Kyiv has not been taken, and I'm sure it will not be taken hostage, if you want. But of course, the small towns around Kyiv, like Bucha and Irpin, Tomel, have been under attack as well for a month already, and the people from there those who could, they have left the cities, and the local authorities, however, they pushed out the Russian army from Irpin, for example. This is the news that I've got just recently. The local authorities are warning people not to come back, actually, because it's still very dangerous. And yeah, there's all kind of traps and so it's not safe to come back. Yes, but in general, this war has shown that the regions of Ukraine which are closest to Russia were under the main risk. And ironically, those are the regions where people mostly speak in Russian, for example, and maybe were hesitant about how they perceive Russia in the beginning. But now, of course, everybody is very, very much against this country, this regime, anything that connects to it, actually. And the western part of Ukraine has experienced heavy bombing as well, but mostly on the strategic objects where there is a fuel storage, for example, or a military airport or something like that. So the people here are also hearing and living under the sound of bombs, and also the people who have left, especially with little children, not to live under this situation. But of course, it's not comparable to what the people from the eastern part of Ukraine had to come through, and some of them had to go through it again after 2014 because they have fled their houses once in the beginning of this 8 years war, basically, and they have left everything. They have lost their houses, their jobs, whatever. They had to start the life again in Kyiv and other cities. Some of them moved to Kharkiv, for example, which is another, like, more than 1 million people lived there, and now the Kharkiv is also almost destroyed. So they had to flee again.
From what you're saying, I can understand that probably the whole situation is like a nightmare. Obviously, I have not experienced a situation like this, but how is the feeling of being forced to flee from your own flat, from your own home, and go to move to another city or to another country?
I mean, it has made, and you've probably seen this, it has made many people very angry. And the most important thing is that for us, it was not necessarily a surprise. I personally was living with anxiety since the beginning of winter, since the beginning of December, when the first signals were kind of very obvious about the fact that Russia started packing up its military around the borders of Ukraine. And for many people, it has become like a point of no return, I would say, and it made us understand practically what it means to fight for your independence and what it means to have a connection to your land and be ready to defend it if it's needed, with the means that you have. Because for Ukrainians, this is not. First of all, for us, this war is a war for independence. This is not a war between West and East or whatever. This is not a war to join NATO. This is an attack on Ukraine as a nation. And this is not the first war for independence that we've had. And for many people, I think this has become a trigger to learn more about the history of Ukraine and our history of fighting for independence, including fighting with Russian empire for our independence. So many people, I think, felt more connected than ever to the fact that they are Ukrainians and to their history, to their roots, to their land. Even those, I have some friends who were thinking about moving and looking for a different life, a more easy one, perhaps, or a more organized one in a different city in the EU, for example. They have changed their mind. And the only thing they want right now, and the only thing I want right now, is to actually go home and to continue working and to help rebuild this country. So this has been a huge lesson of how we can work together and how connected we really are in such difficult times. And I, to be honest, have never been more proud to have the roots that I have and to be native to this land. Yes, but of course it has been also the stress and the damage to the mental health that has been done already is horrible. And I think not everybody even understands it yet. And we still have a long process to go for all of these wounds to start healing. And this is, of course, why many have left the country, although they feel like their heart has been taken out of them when they were crossing the borders into nowhere. And of course, they have been cared for, and there has been a lot of support, especially from the neighboring countries. But all the people who I know who have left the country cannot wait to go back. And I think we will have a huge problem, not a problem, but like we can get through this, but like a challenge to work with mental health of millions and millions of people and millions of children who maybe have not realized what they have gone through yet.
We every day hear and read about governments and organizations and NGOs that call for a ban on Russian oil and gas. How important is this move for Ukraine right now?
So I am personally a climate activist, and I have been working for climate NGOs for more than 5 years. Right now, I'm coordinator of Climate Action Network in the region of Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia. So ironically, I have been working with all of these post-Soviet countries, including Russia, for quite some time. And in Ukraine, I am part of the organization called EcoAction. So basically, we after the first kind of wave of shock passed, we started to think about how we can be useful in this situation, because we are not necessarily the ones to go and fight in the military right now, because we don't have the skills, etc. But we do have the knowledge, and we can connect the dots that are connected to the fossil fuels. And so what we have seen is, of course, basically the EU mostly have been on Russian fossil fuels. And of course, it's not a secret that Russia heavily relies on fossil fuels for their economy. So in terms of connecting the dots, for us, it was obvious that calling for a ban on fossil fuels would destabilize a Russian economy and would put pressure, maybe just enough pressure for them to overthink what they are doing right now and the effects that it would have. An additional layer here for me was that the fact that, as I have been working with all of these countries of Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia, what I have also seen is how weakened the civil society is in many of those countries. And it's not by chance, it is done deliberately. So where there is a strong civil society, there will be riots, there will be protests, and eventually the democracy should prevail, or there will be, a violent end to those protests, which we also seen. So for me, the layer of the fact that Russian civil society has been oppressed for so many years, and there's just like a parallel universe, I think, for many of Ukrainians who have not worked with Russia, who have not spoken to it, who don't have relatives there. It has been a shock that during the first days, Ukrainians have been asking Russian people, just anybody, to go and protest, that this is unimaginable, this should not be happening. And I mean, there were some protests, but I knew that it would not lead to anywhere, because I knew in which condition the civil society in Russia is, and that basically all of the active, free-thinking people probably have already left or are about to leave. So it was also important to join this, to connect again these dots between the oppressed civil society, totalitarian regime, and how it heavily relies on fossil fuels, and that this is all connected. And by targeting one of those things, by targeting, for example, the businesses of fossil fuels, we can destabilize all of this system, and maybe in a few years give a chance, a light for actually either the civil society to start developing again and learn from their mistakes, or just for the country in general to become less reliant on fossil fuels. But in any case, for Ukrainians, the most important thing right now is to stop the war. So we have been trying to find the right leverages to pull. And I think that the one that we as climate movement have found, the most effective one, is of course connected to the economy on fossil fuels. And this has already triggered a huge response and actually a huge destabilization in Russia for them asking to pay for gas in rubles, for example, shows that they have already started to understand how serious it all is. But we're also seeing a kind of a hesitation from some of the countries in the EU. Of course, they are not ready for the prices to skyrocket. They do not know from which countries they should import fossil fuels instead. And of course, here our messaging for the future and in terms of strategy is you should not pick a different country to import your fossil fuels from. You should phase out fossil fuels. This is what we have been talking about for years. And so right now, I believe that we have kind of found a very important topic that connects to other different topics, like the war, the human rights, the climate change, economy. It's all connected, and it feels like it has all been triggered by this war.
Actually, it was my next question. If you feel that other countries are doing much to help and support Ukraine right now, even in the form of sanctions imposed on Russian gas and oil?
I mean, as long as the war still continues, I would say that more can be done, But we are appreciative of all the support that we've seen, starting from the support from person to person and ending up the support from the governments. We have seen this with Great Britain, of course, as well. Yeah, we're actually seeing at the situation as it develops and hoping for actually more countries to become more ambitious in this term. So basically, this is like a very concentrated period of time when, if we compare it to what has been happening before, we were talking about climate change and that urgent action needs to be taken. We have been talking about it for years, that the time is now, and here the time is really now, because in 1 minute someone will die, and in 2 minutes someone else will die, and the missiles are still flying. And there were some news about the de-escalation, but the fact that the war is still ongoing, the missiles are still falling, and the people are still dying. So for us, of course, until the war doesn't end, we can do more. We ourselves can do more, and our partners in the EU can do more. But also, I really urge our partners in the EU countries to actually think strategically and understand that this will need to be done eventually anyway, because you do not want to change dependency on one totalitarian regime to another, for example. But we are seeing right now, as I said, a lot of hesitation, probably from like the top level, because in terms of on-the-ground support, I think that it is overwhelming, and maybe this on-the-ground support, the support from the people, from the activists, from the NGOs, especially exactly what I was talking about, the strong civil society in those hesitating countries would actually help to achieve much better results in terms of phasing out fossil fuels from Russia. I know that since the beginning of the war, since 24th of February, there's a great calculator made by one of the EU organizations about how much money has actually EU paid to Russia since the beginning of the war. So it's more than 22 billion euros for oil, gas, and coal. And I think that, and this was done by the EU activists. So this kind of support and this kind of pressure, basically bottom-up pressure, is, I think, what will help us all to get closer to the victory and even overstep it, if you know what I mean. So even after the official war ends, the effects will still be ongoing. And it has been said by some of the officials, by Boris Johnson as well, I think, that the sanction will not be cancelled immediately when officially the war stops, because this is much bigger than the concrete, rockets falling in concrete cities. This is about the power dynamics that we have allowed to continue for many, many years. And now suddenly some countries realize that maybe depending on this dictator is not a really good idea, but we cannot stop depending on him in one day. So what should we do? So this has raised a lot of very important questions that should have been risen many years ago.
My last question for you, Olga, is regarding the climate activism in Ukraine. We hear a lot about climate movements in Europe, in the US, but not so much about what is happening in places like Ukraine, where the narrative tends to focus on the battle with and the reliance on Russia. How the Ukrainians are engaged in the climate crisis right now?
We're actually very much engaged, and I am talking more about from the perspective, of course, of the region of Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia, where I would say the Ukraine was a leading country for many years. We have seen a rise in the climate policy ambition during the last years. We have seen a lot of good signals from the local level. For example, we have been going through the process of decentralization. So now the cities, the communities, they have much more power and budget to actually decide for themselves what they want to do. And we have been also in action working with these local communities, local NGOs, who themselves work with the local governments. And we have seen a lot of them actually stepping up their climate policy in terms of lowering emissions, planning for adaptation to climate change, etc. Also, so I would say in general, Ukraine has strong civil society in general. The climate part of this civil society is not huge yet, but we are in a very strong, in a very fast growing pattern right now. And we have been active in the international sphere as well, like during the COP negotiations, for example. We have been doing the just transition campaigns, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine, actually, because this is the most heavily industrialized region, and the small towns there depend on one particular coal mine, for example. So this has been going on for quite some time. But I think that after this war, and especially remembering that we just at the beginning of the war, we have connected our energy system to the EU energy system and the ENTSO-E, I think that people will know much more about the Ukrainian activism now. They will meet some people personally, probably, that they wouldn't have met otherwise, because they are now, some of them are in the EU. And I do believe that we can integrate better with the EU climate movement, and this is kind of the desire that I'm also seeing. For now, I would say our organizations have started. Some of them have started doing humanitarian help, so just helping locally where they can to their communities. But many of us are continuing with our work. First of all is the communication, of course, which is very important, to get the information out there and to have interviews like this, for example. But another important issue is, of course, advocacy against fossil fuels and all of the connection that I've mentioned before. And another one, what is going on right now, is the crimes against environment, the war crimes against our nature, basically, which are being counted and by my colleagues as well, and by the Ministry of Environmental Protection. So this information, these results will be public in more kind of later. But for now, we already know that there have been more than 100 such actions that could be considered crimes against environment in terms of this war. And this is something that we are also focused on as environmental movement, to understand how to have our own green recovery, but not the one that we have been talking about after COVID, but the one that will be needed right now after the war. And it is connected to everything, to rebuilding the houses that are energy efficient, to rebuilding the industries that are not reliant on coal, but rather maybe on hydrogen or electricity, for example. So there's a huge kind of field of opportunities for, as I see it, for our climate movement. And I am sure that we will be much more visible from now on.
Olga, thank you very much for your time. It was really a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for giving us the chance to talk to you at such a difficult situation.